Hi everyone. Welcome in this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends a bit where you are. We have many different people joining from different time zones, and we are very glad to have you here. It's a wide array of different people with different backgrounds, and we look forward to presenting to you 1 hour of content, but a full hour of content. There is really a lot of content to make best use of your time, right? So the topic of today is the application of CFD, computational fluid dynamics simulation in pharma and biopharma. And we will give a very short overview of the state of the art. And then we will also illustrate it by means of many case examples. So our goal is really to give you a lot of insights and a very good idea on the practical application of the wonderful simulation tool. So this webinar is organized by AMTE. We will give our company introduction very soon. So let's dig into today's objectives. So the objectives are always the best way to start with. So why are you here? Because the time of all of us is very expensive. And well, we did some really thinking about this, what we were going to present to you today. So let's first put it in a context. Our company, AMTE, has officially launched a dedicated pharma and process industry business unit. So we will talk about that later, but we got a lot of questions and we were able to also answer a lot of them. And this is why we have decided to really put a dedicated business unit around that. So this is a very important webinar for us to also connect with you at the global level, at a more massive scale, let's say. And what are the objectives of today? So we would really hope by the end of this webinar that you end with knowing what CFD is, basic understanding, that you are also aware of the possibilities and what it can do, and also the state of the art. And what is most important is that you are aware about the practical value. So how can it really be applied to solve the big pains? And also that it's kind of an awareness as well. So you will see a lot of case examples that will probably make you think, okay, probably these kind of decisions operationally or design-wise, they really have a big impact sometimes on process performance, while it's not always that visible. So these are 4 very important objectives. This also means that we keep the format quite different from a regular, let's say, conference presentation, which goes deep. This webinar will go wide. So our goal is to really give you a very broad overview on what are the possibilities, what are the types of problems you can solve with it, rather than digging very deep in the numerics and things like that. So people have sufficient of that content. And we also expect, looking at the target audience here, that this is the most interesting strategy, going deep. And we can always go, going wide, sorry, we can always go deeper afterwards. You can send us emails and things like that. Of course, during the webinar, you will have the possibility to answer questions. So this is using the Q&A window. If you hover over your screen, you will see a Q&A functionality, and this will be continuously monitored by our moderator. So if you have any questions and they're really very relevant for the broad audience here, we will answer them live during the webinar. So really don't hesitate to ask any question. There are also no stupid questions. All questions are very good questions. After the webinar, there will be a short questionnaire. So if you close the window of Zoom, you will be seeing a pop-up window with a questionnaire. It would be really great if you could fill your feedback after the webinar. If you haven't filled it in, we will anyway send you also the link of the form later via email. But please give us your feedback. So who are we? Only 2 slides, but quite important, of course. You have to know who's talking here and yeah, where do they come from and things like that. What do they do, these guys? We are AMTE. AMTE is a Belgian-based company, but as you can see on the world map, we are actually acting globally. So our customers are really all over the place. We are currently working on projects at 4 continents. There's not really like, at the global level, we have not really limits. And our company is highly specialized in computational fluid dynamics and specialized also in kinetics. So this is really our core business. So we use these tools to provide cutting-edge process simulation services to the global process industry. We started out in the water industry, where there are a lot of complex processes. I mean complex, which are dynamic, not very easy to model, a mixture of solids, liquids, gas. And we also got a lot of questions from pharma, from chemical industry, other process industry sectors. And it was really time to double down on that, because we have developed a lot of unique models throughout the years, and we can readily apply them in these different fields. So you can see some of our customers on the screen, but it's actually comes down to a wide array of customers, small companies to very big companies to multinationals, and also consulting engineering firms, and also equipment manufacturers. So it's really a wide array of companies we work with. So this is our current team. We are very proud of these people here. They are all engineers, different backgrounds, different types of engineers. So we have chemical engineers, bioprocess engineers, mechanical engineers, and all of them are very good at modeling. So we really combine process knowledge with simulation, very unique simulation capabilities. And this is really our unique, what makes our company very unique. It's a combination of process and very good simulation capabilities. And if you're a simulation company, you have to provide workable, practical solutions. And there's only one way to prove that, that is by means of customer ratings. And this is why we always put them onto the screen. It's kind of a sales, more like a sales talk, but they are very important because this is really all of the customers we have questioned throughout the last 2 years. And the scores are typically very good in terms of expertise we have, but also in terms of working with us and the service you get, and the solutions, the practicality of the solutions. Who is in this webinar today? Well, I am Wim Oudenaert. I'm CEO and co-founder at AMTE. I have actually a background in process modeling, more kinetics. I did my PhD, for example, on the topic of oxidation and advanced oxidation processes, a lot of chemistry involved there. But then we have my fellow founder, co-founder of this company, Dr. Usman Rehman here as well. He's the CTO of this company. And he will be answering quite some questions during the webinar, but at least also moderating it. And then we have the moderator of this webinar, Celia de Wilde. She's a business development manager at AMTE, and she will be monitoring the Q&A, and she will bring the questions live if they are relevant at the slide at hand and for the audience. Let's start with the content, because this is why you came here. And it's always a good start with some challenges and problems and take it from there. So let's start with the challenges and of process operation, design, and scale up. There are quite some, and I'm pretty sure many of you have experiences with it. The first important fact is that process design is rather complex. So it means you want to design something and it has to get a certain desired result. Typically in a production environment, like a pharma, bioprocess industry, it is specs, product specs. So you have to design your process. You can choose about reactors, impellers, but then you have water or other liquids going on. You have bubbles, so there can be gases involved. And there can also be particles or flux that are in your process. It depends really on the application. Also, it should not really be a reactor. It can be a vessel. It can be a manifold, a pipe. So this is a system, right? And then often you also have reactions, biochemical or chemical reactions going on in your process. If you bring together all of these things, process design is rather complex because it's not so straightforward, all these phenomena that are taking place in parallel. The question, a very important question we wanted to answer with our company is, what if we could reduce, complement, or replace real-life experimenting and piloting by computer simulation? But I mean very realistic computer simulation. And in the end, actually, you can get stuff out of there that you can impossibly measure in reality. And this is also where, well, we are going to give a lot of examples on. Very important question. Fact number 2 is scaling up. Scaling down is very difficult. Again, pharma field, there is a lot of scaling to be done. small scales, even scale down to understand it better, and scale up to the manufacturing scale. It is not straightforward, and there is a big reason for that. One of those is this. What is often assumed is if you scale up a system, that the molecules scale along with the system. But in reality, actually, you simply get more of them. And this is causing very non-linear behavior in your system. So we typically tell to our customers quite often, unfortunately, molecules do not scale along with the reactor. This would make things much easier, but it is not happening, unfortunately. So that's scaling up, scaling down is highly nonlinear, not very straightforward, and the costs and time associated to it are huge. So we are talking about massive amounts. Well, let's go to the solution CFD, or one of the solutions, let's say. We typically present CFD like these gears. We call them our gears here. And if you look at CFD, it can include liquids, solids, or also gases. This is what we call the phases, 1, 2, 3 phase. It can actually include all of those in a simulation. Well, of course, CFD is also capable of including in the simulation your process settings. This can be viscosity, temperature, a certain design, a certain size, scale, flow rates. This is the process settings. And then you have kinetics. So if you have any conversions or chemical or biochemical reactions going on, they can be readily plugged in into CFD to solve specific questions. It really depends on the objective of the projects, which gears we use. We call it a plug and play of the gears. And you can have very sophisticated models that are multi-phase with kinetics, or you can have a rather straightforward, simple CFD model. It all depends on the objective. Okay, so conceptually, CFD is based on physical first principles. That's really the heart of CFD. They are called the Navier-Stokes equations. We will not put them on the slide here because I think the participants will start dropping very rapidly. But just remember, it's based on physics. And yeah, because you have a very reliable and good physics structure as a heart, as a core, this is not really based on trial and error. If it's properly done, you are starting from a highly mechanistic model. So this is how it conceptually works. You have either an existing or a new system. What you see on the screen now is an existing system. It is an existing vessel. It can be something else as well, but this is a vessel. Step number one is we create a 3D geometry. This geometry includes the real dimensions, the critical parts, which are the inlets, outlets typically, but also other things, for example, in this case, an impeller, and also the impeller type and the impeller speed. Once you have done that, we start meshing. Meshing means we start dividing the whole volume in little cells, and they can be easily 1 to 2 million cells, which means we are talking about high resolution simulation. Imagine you have a reactor of 1 liter and you have 1 million cells. The average volume of each of the cells is 1 liter divided by 1 million. So it's really high resolution, accurate modeling. Luckily, we have very good computers nowadays. So this was really the final barrier to be removed to make it a very reliable engineering tool. And then finally, what you get is simulation output. I will not go into the details here what this output means, because we will have a dedicated slide on it and a lot of examples. So, but typically people associate CFD with the colorful drawings, many beautiful colors that tell you something. Okay, let's go back to the pharma industry. These are the big four groups of properties or factors that determine the ultimate process performance and cost. On one hand, we are talking about operational parameters. On the other hand, we are talking about the design parameters. Let's start with the operational parameters. Operational parameters are your inputs. For example, raw materials you use. It can be density, viscosity, dissolution rates. There are a lot of properties of the inputs. On the other hand, you have your very important process parameters. For example, your temperature, your pressure, dosing locations of certain chemicals or certain solutes or solvents, flow rates, important process parameters. And then you have human factors, such as who is operating this, I just give one simple example. You have to add some powder or some solids to a tank. The way you add the powder can have a significant impact on how the dissolution, for example, looks like. There are some human factors as well. CFD can actually be used to do what we call what-if testing. So you can start playing with all of these single process parameters virtually without having to test them in practice. It means bubble sizes, particle sizes, viscosity, concentrations, or any other operational parameter, for example, flow rates. So this is what you can use CFD for. Let's go to the design side. Very, very important. Again, you can use CFD to play with your design. What are design impacts or factors? One very important one is the reactor. If you have a reactor or a vessel, size, scale, the type and geometry. Do you use baffles? Where do you introduce your products or things like that? Certain systems have transfer going on, for example, gas, liquid, mass transfer or dissolution. And sometimes you also have mixing equipment. So all of these things are critical for the performance. Again, with CFD, you can actually play with the size, play with the scale, and test different types of equipment and assess the impact on your performance. So this is really key to understand before we go to the case examples. So what are kind of different application cases we have been working on in our company? There are actually many, many more than on this slide, but this is just a selection of them. Well, one, we are talking about mixing and blending applications, dissolution of solids in a vessel, precipitation, crystallization reactions, flow distribution analysis, oxidation processes, sprays, fluidized beds, packed beds. We talk about shear stress analysis in certain equipment, so the shear on your product for sensitive molecules. We talk about membrane filtration setups, bioreactors, which includes the biochemical conversions, the oxygen transfer. We talk about heat exchange, and we talk about biochemical or chemical synthesis. So this is really the primary stage of the production. So it can really be wide, and just take this home when you go through this webinar. If we show a specific example and it's not really that relevant for you, try to really like put yourself in the shoes of how it would look like when it was applied to your example. So it's really very similar patterns you will see. So the power of CFD is really that you can test what you cannot test in reality, and that you can also visualize what you cannot really measure in reality. Okay, so let's start with a first case example. It's a very low barrier entrance, very simple case example, everybody will understand it, and then we will gradually build up. This is a case example related to PAT sensor optimization. So the case at hand here was actually also published scientifically. You can see the reference at the bottom. And this work was actually conducted by the people at Ghent University. That was actually the lab we are a spin-off company from. So these people have done quite a nice practical study, and I will just outline it a bit here. So at one hand, you have a vessel, a holding tank of 150 liters holding an API solution, and you have to stir it continuously. Some foam was being produced. It's not really desired. So that's, of course, a specific question where you can look into with CFD, how to minimize foam formation. But this was not the question here. So the problem was, because you have foam, the level of API you have in your foam compared to your bulk suspension can differ a few percentages. So you can have somewhat more API in the foam, for example. So it means when the process goes further and progresses, your concentration at the outlet, if you're pumping with a certain flow rate, might also start changing. To have better control on this and when to stop the process, these people actually decided to put an NIR sensor in line to have a very good idea on the API concentration. Of course, such a sensor is it's put in a channel. You can see here the flow is coming through, and the sensor is like lateral to the flow with a window. Of course, ideally, your sensor online gives the same readings than your offline liquid chromatography measurements, which are the yellow dots. This was not really the case initially. You can see that there is some signal disturbance, not really caused by the foam, but caused by something else. So if you, these guys have actually analyzed the channel. You see a lot of turbulence going on here. And this was causing these flow patterns, non-optimal flow patterns in this measurement channel were causing the disturbances you see here. So this is actually a CFD analysis of this channel. Yeah. So it's a channel of a few centimeters in diameter. So, well, then you can use CFD to redesign. And one of the questions was, can we maybe make this pipe a bit longer to have a better flow development? And then how much longer it should be? And you can see if you make it longer, indeed, you have much less turbulence, much more streamlined flow in this channel, and ultimately leading to a much better signal stability. So this was really a nice outcome of this case study. So using CFD to redesign equipment rather than just doing trial and error based troubleshooting. It was a very efficient way of solving a problem. So before I go to this section, I will just ask my colleague moderator, Celia, if there are any questions.
For now, there are no questions. So you
Perfect.
can continue.
Okay. Good, then we can go to a bit more advanced content, let's say. Question we will now ask ourselves is, what can you really extract from CFD? So what can you quantify and visualize? Before you use it, you have to know what it gives you. So what we have seen in the example is mixing patterns, right? So velocity vectors, how is your flow? How is your mixing? This is where typically people associate CFD with mixing patterns. And typically the colors you see, these nice colors, are high to low. This is the color gradient, the color scale that is used to actually show the output in a quantitative way. But it's not only mixing patterns, and this is really key to this webinar. Let's look into what is all available in terms of output. You can actually look at tracer transport. For example, if you have a vessel, you have an incoming flow. So this is a dip pipe here. You can actually visualize, let's say, give the flow a color, a certain color, which we call a virtual tracer, to visualize how it mixes with the bulk liquid here. You can see it goes down drastically in this case, so there's definitely room for improvement. This is tracer transport, but you can also look at particle deposition. For example, this is the top of a filter, and these are particles retained on top of the filter. You can look at particle transport. So for example, if you add some granules that have to be dissolved, you can actually visualize and track each of those granules and how they travel. You can look at concentrations. So if you include kinetics in your CFD simulation, you can visualize in the 3D space your concentrations of interest. For example, at the left case here, this is a fermenter where you see the concentration of a specific nutrient. At the right, this long reactor here, this is a chemical oxidation reactor. So you can really visualize concentrations in 3D using CFD if the kinetics are used. You can be looking at velocity gradients, which is called the G values. You can look at shear on surfaces, for example, the surface of a membrane, very important for the membrane performance. Or you can look at the shear stress on liquids on your products. And as you can see here, and we will see a very detailed example on that, in the vicinity of the impeller, of course, you have much more stress on your product. And you can also look at gas holdup, for example. This is a bioreactor case where we look at the oxygen, in this case, pure oxygen, how it distributes with the water. So this is just a slide illustrating that you can extract a lot of information out of CFD, and many of those variables are very, very difficult to measure in reality. Just think about shear, how you would actually measure that in a reactor. So let's go to a second case example now, where we will actually insert kinetics in CFD. So this is dissolution in the manufacturing stage. So it's not dissolution in the guts of the human body. This is a dissolution vessel with an impeller, a very simple system. And you have a couple of manholes, and you have a shaft and the impeller. Very important questions here are, First one, what will be the dissolution and the homogenization time for my specific components in that specific setup? Because components or APIs, they change all the time, and you cannot always use the same scale and also not the same setup within a certain scale. So that's a very important question. Second one is how to reliably scale up, but also at a decent pace and cost without having to do a lot of trial and error based testing. So two key questions here. So we did a couple of scenarios here with a base case, the starting vessel, let's say, and then 5 other scenarios. I will not go into much detail here because it's too much information, but it's, I will just quickly describe what we have done. We have played with the solutes. For example, we have compared sodium chloride dissolution versus glucose. Of course, glucose dissolution rate is much lower than sodium chloride. We have looked how the introduction strategy through the manholes impacts performance, 1 manhole, 2 manholes. We have looked at the scale, a 50-liter vessel versus a 1,000-liter vessel. And we also did something with the impeller. So let's take a look at this. So before I start the slides, this is a lot of information. It's all moving. You can see that a lot of things are happening here. I will play it again, so don't be worried. I will just explain what you see here. At the top here, this is the vessel, and what you see is the solute you add, okay? For example, sodium chloride, it mixes, starts dissolving, and finally disappears. Here you can see the same, but in a curve. So this is the mass of solutes as function of time. And of course, if it reaches 0, you have complete dissolution. What you see here is the dissolution curves. So the amount of mass that has been dissolved, the average, the black one is the real dissolution curve, or the maximum concentration locally observed in the vessel, and the minimum, which is the red line, observed concentration in the vessel. Of course, if the minimum, the maximum, and the average coincide, you have a complete homogenization. And what you see here is the dissolution rate. So the speed of dissolution, of course, initially when you have nothing dissolved, the speed is very high. So I will just play everything one more time so you see what's happening. Here you see that you almost reach complete dissolution, and then you have also reached final homogenization. In this specific case, the time for complete homogenization was around 16% longer than the complete time for dissolution. We will just explain why this happens. So this is again, the non-dissolved mass, what you have seen before. We add the powder through 1 manhole, and then this is the dissolved mass. So it starts dissolving, of course. So this is in the liquid phase, and this is the solid. So let's play them again. You get the dissolution at the left, but at the right, you can see that there is still some work to be done at the homogenization side. So this takes way longer in this specific setup. Okay, it's very setup specific. So this gives a lot of insights. Of course, if you change the impeller or diameter or scale, things will, of course, look very different. So let's look at all these scenarios together. For example, the biggest difference, as we can expect, is between glucose and sodium chloride. You can see that glucose takes much longer to dissolve or to completely dissolve compared to sodium chloride. But if we look into the sodium chloride scenarios, you can see that there is quite a difference between the full scale 1,000-liter scale in this case and the smaller 50-liter scale, which are the other 3 curves. And you should actually compare the full scale, the one manhole, with the 1 manhole, the orange curve of the 50-liter vessel. But the added dose was a bit more, so that's why the maximum of the curves deviates a bit. But you can see actually, if you look at these dissolution curves, that the impact of scale, components, and if you would change your temperature, well, all these things would, of course, drastically impact. And let's just look at the case, the same kind of plots, but for a changed impeller at the bottom. It's now at the bottom here under an angle. You see the dissolved, non-dissolved mass. And if you study this again, you see that the pattern is different. You can get kind of an embracement, right? So the bottom layer embraces the top layer. So hydrodynamics, of course, can be quite different if you change certain specs. Okay, so this was, well, we have a huge amount of information behind that case. But again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.
Yes, I will jump in.
Yeah.
There is one question concerning bubble columns. If the mixing time is around 30 seconds or up to a minute, if CFD is still beneficial. I think this highly depends on what the goal of the question or the project is, but I will let you explain what we can do.
Mm-hmm. So you mean, Celia, if your process takes a couple of minutes in reality?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I
for
think
example,
if it's a really short mixing time, we can.
Oh yeah, well, definitely, yeah, definitely. We have done many cases. Well, in some of the applications, very fast mixing is very important. Very fast. I mean,
so even a matter of seconds then.
Exactly. So it depends on the application. We have to look at it. For example, if you have reactions going on, well, mixing is very important, especially if you have very fast kinetics. Yeah, it really depends on the case. But equipment design, you can, of course, I don't think if you have not used CFD and you are talking about a mixing application, I would say chances are very limited that you cannot improve it. Probably you can.
Okay, and another question popped up concerning the dissolution case, if the impeller was upward pumping or downward pumping.
Okay, that one was downwards. We have not shown the velocity vectors because, yeah, most of the people are familiar with them. But if you look into them, you see, yeah, you nicely see the swirls. Yeah, so it pumps up from the bottom. Of course, it's, yeah, if you install some baffles at the sides, it, of course, has a huge impact on the homogenization time, which we didn't do now. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's continue on a bioreactor example. Very short case study, and then we go to a longer one again. So this is a case study of a 2-liter batch reactor in the lab. And what you can see here, these color gradients, they show the local concentrations of certain species. In this case, oxygen, dissolved oxygen, ammonium, and nitrates. You can visualize all kinds of things, but the message here is if you look at a 2 liters bioreactor, you already have significant gradients. So it's very hard to, even at a small scale, to have, let's say, complete mixing. Which is often assumed definitely in small scale systems. So this was a study actually conducted a few years ago by Usman, who's in this call. Of course, if you would start changing the inlet and outlet and diameter or bubble size, things like that, it would have a drastic impact on the process performance. That's one example here. But a very easy to understand example is this one. It's also a bioreactor, but a very different scale. Now we are not talking about 2 liters, but we are talking about 1,500 cubic meters. So let's play the movie. So this is actually a bioreactor where pure oxygen is injected via 2 mixing devices. Yeah, so the oxygen comes in, and you see that near the bottom you have a dead zone. Bad mixing, dark blue zone near the bottom. We did a very small design change. We only changed them half a meter. And then you rerun the simulation and you can see that you have much higher velocities with the same mixing energy. It's a very fast movie, I know, but you can watch it again at our YouTube channel. But it just illustrates, it just to make you aware, if you do something very small, it can have a big impact without knowing it. So this is on bioreactors very shortly. So you can introduce gases, mass transfer, and biological conversions. Okay, let's look at another case example. This is example number 4, liquid shear stress. So the shear stress on your products. So why is shear important? Well, shear can actually damage bigger sensitive molecules. We are talking about some biomolecules, proteins, or very large organic molecules. The problem with that is if they have faced some shear, they can lead to a product deterioration after a while, but the impact is not immediately visible. And that's a bit the problem here. So it's all about risk minimization and designing your system as such that you minimize the risk on product damage. And we all know, if you talk about many of these products in the pharma and biopharma world, they are very expensive. So there's not too much room to lose products. We will show two examples. One is, again, a mixing vessel where we will be playing with the impeller. One is a vertical pedal impeller, and then we just change it with a folded impeller under an angle. And we also look at the shear in just a simple pipe with a narrowing, what you can see here. It's often used and happening, where you pump liquids or suspensions, for example. And then we will also be looking at a very simple manifold. The main flow gets split into two subflows. So what is the stress of the certain product in these applications? Very important questions. From practical point of view, first you want to know, what is the shear stress on my product throughout my whole system? And maybe where are the stress hotspots? How is the shear stress different across lines and across different scales? For example, if we scale up, it might have a different stress. And how can we minimize or mitigate the risk on damaging the sensitive products? So these are very, very important questions. We have just 4 scenarios to show here to you. These are the 4 scenarios I was talking about. The vessel, we just test 2 different impellers. We have this banded narrowing pipe, and then we have this manifold. The only thing I have to add here is that we have run the simulation for both a Newtonian fluid, for example, water or ethanol. So something that keeps the same viscosity all the time. And we also have done it for a non-Newtonian fluid. Some of the suspensions are like that, emulsions. You have a lot of such solutions. So the thing here is, the viscosity, the local viscosity is a function of the local stress level. So that's a very different behavior. So let's look at the vessel. At the left, these 2 tanks here have the impeller number 1. At the right, you see impeller number 2. And what we visualize on this slide is the strain rate. So the strain rate contains the shear stress. So red means high local strain rates. Dark blue means nearly 0 strain rates. Of course, I have been telling this before, around the impeller, in the vicinity of it, you have quite a high stress level. And look at the 2 impellers, this one here for the Newtonian fluid, NF, and the second one for the Newtonian fluid. You see that actually the patterns are quite different, because obviously this impeller directs the flow more downwards. It pushes it downwards. But quite interesting to see is if you compare Newtonian liquids with non-Newtonian, for example, a high viscosity fluid, you see that actually you get kind of a buffering of this stress here locally. So it's locally you actually absorb a lot of the stress, while further down the road or further from the impellers, you get a different profile. So they look quite different. You can see these profiles, they look quite different. But again, well, this is a system we use quite often. You can look at these figures, but it's not so easy to understand. So our colleagues, well, my colleagues Usman and Ingmar have developed this framework, which we call Riemann-Nopens curves, which actually summarize all these 3D results from 4 different cases on one 2D graph. So you can easily compare them now. What we plot here is actually the same strain rates on the x-axis against the volume of your vessel. So this is actually the strain rate distribution over your volume. If you would have the same strain rates all across the vessel, it would be a vertical curve, but it's not the case, as we know. So high strain rates are this volume, for example, 2.5 per second, has for this orange, well, dotted curve is like 20% of the volume. From 80 to 100 is higher than 2.5. This is how you have to read it. So let's look at the impellers. It is very clear if you look at the orange curves compared with the purple ones. These are the 2 different impellers, that the vertical impeller the pedal impeller causes a lot, much more strain rates all across the volume of the reactor. They have the same rotation speeds, but you can see that the strain rate is quite different. If you look at then non-Newtonian, which is the dashed lines, versus the Newtonian fluid, which is the solid lines, you can see generally you have a shift to the right, which means generally the strain rate will be higher on these liquids with the same type of system. But it's not all over the place, because you can see that there is kind of 15% of your reactor which has a much higher strain rates, much lower strain rates. So it's really dependent on where you look. So you can see that the curves are not like completely shifting to the right. There is a part that shifts to the left. We can do the same kind of analysis for these pipes. Again, compare the Newtonian fluid, which is orange, to the non-Newtonian one, which is again purple, for these pipes. Here it's a bit more complex. Just look at the flow rates patterns. You can see if you, for example, have water coming in here, there is kind of a short circuiting happening here. So you cross the channel and you go to the second exit. This is much less the case with the higher viscosity fluid. Even though the flow rate is exactly the same. These things, together with wall effects, have of course also very different strain rates. So what we see here in the colors again is the strain rates. Of course, you have it where you have a narrowing, definitely, but also where you have a bend. So where you have a bend near the wall, there's quite some stress on the product, and it gets enlarged definitely in this band when you have non-Newtonian liquids. But you can see they cross each other all the time, these curves. So it's a bit more complicated because the geometries are a bit more complicated. Of course, take home here, you can actually, again, redesign these type of things to have a much more stress-friendly environment. So this is where you can use CFD for. I will just first go to my colleague again, Celia, if there are any questions that have to be answered.
Yes, there's just a new question. If we have to check how to limit the maximum shear rate. Not sure if we have, or how we
question. I think the maximum shear rate, I think if I'm correct, so if I'm not correct, ask your question again or a second one. But I would assume that the question means, do you have to look at your peak shear in your system? Maybe there is a short exposure, but a very high shear somewhere locally. And exactly, this is what matters. We talk about shear exposure. For example, if you have a very low shear, but your liquid stays very long there, you will have a certain exposure that can be equally high than having a very high shear, but very short residence time around that area. Both the overall shear, but also the local shear are very important criteria to look at. And these hotspots probably should be minimized. Another question, Celia?
No, then there was also another example that was mentioned for where shear comes into play is for fungal fermentations, that it can impact the growth and product yield. I think there are multiple cases like this where shear can have an impact, not only on the material, but also on the process.
Exactly. You can be talking about flux in bioreactors. So these are aggregates of microorganisms. The flux are very sensitive to shear. How they look like, how they will granulate, it will be driven by physical chemical factors, but also by the shear. So we are not talking about molecules only, definitely not. So you have seen in this example, changing an impeller can have a huge impact. Most of the people know it will change the mixing, but often it's not really visible what the impact really can be on your product quality, for example. Also simple bands or narrowings. Yeah, very important. Okay, so let's go to the fifth case example, the last one actually, and then we have some conclusions and also room for Q&A. Packed bed columns. Again, something completely different application. Packed beds are used in filtration. They are used in reactions. For example, if you have a catalytic bed, one good example is oligonucleotides, which are very big protein-like molecules, which you synthesize on a polymeric substrate. But then you have packed beds for filtration, all kinds of packed beds. Well, typically, if you have a packed bed, you have your packing, which is this inner cylinder. You have a certain column, which is the outer big cylinder, and you have an entrance and an exit. Of course, systems can look a bit different, but generally, conceptually, it comes down to this. In this case, we have been modeling a packed bed with a polymer packing that is actually susceptible to the kind of solvent you put on it. So if you change a solvent on a polymer, the polymer can actually start shrinking or expanding. So that can happen. If it does that, of course, your porosity of your bed, also your resistance of your bed, and finally your pressure drop over your bed, and also your dynamics, flow dynamics through your bed, it will all change. So just to illustrate it a bit, we have done this CFD simulation where you will see the bed expanding. Again, I will not go into these numbers too much, but we have been testing different fluids. I mean, change the viscosity, change the density, and we even did a scenario where one fluid has to remove the other one, how they mix. We have changed flow rates. We have played with the resistance. For example, how fine is your packing material? We have changed the height and the diameter as well. So different scenarios, don't pay too much attention to which scenario is what. I will come back to that. So what you will be seeing here is a lot of information again. These are just 6 from these 7 scenarios. You can see the big diameter in the middle, and then the other ones have the same diameter. But for example, it can be another solvent, or the flow rate can be changed. It can be 2 solvents. It can be a low resistance or high resistance. So just let's play everything first and then analyze. So this is how things happen here. You see the color indicates the incoming solution. So it doesn't mean that there is not a solution in the beginning. So the column was initially filled with either the same solvent or another one in scenario 7, the same one in the other ones. So it's not that if you don't see anything, for example, a transparent color, that there is not anything happening. The color is the new solvent we add from the start. So let's play everything again. It's a lot of information. First conclusion, behavior across these systems is quite different, right? Of course, look at the high resistance versus low resistance. In the high resistance, you get much more plug flow behavior. It's kind of a rainbow pattern. While in the low resistance case, your solvent can actually shoot through the bed more or less. And it can be exiting already before your initial liquid volume was removed. So here your entering liquid will actually start removing your existing liquid, let's call it that way. And here you can actually have a mixture, and it can take a while. Here you have 100% incoming solvent in this case. Of course, if you have a large diameter and apply the same flow rate, it takes much longer. And combined with a high resistance, yeah, it gives a completely different result. I don't think it makes sense to go over each of those simulations in detail. But what maybe one point I should mention is just pay attention to the expanding polymer bed. So you see it expanding and shrinking, which we have included in this simulation, depending on what you put in it. Of course, these synthesis reactions, in this case, this is a synthesis reaction. They can take a few hours. No? We are just summarizing everything here in a simulation of a few seconds. So it's a lot of information here. Okay, so this is packed bed columns, just to illustrate that you can also play with such kind of systems.
Then maybe
Another question?
Yeah, there's another question. I don't know if you or Usman will answer. It's about formulation development that typically then we are interested in how solids are blended, how granules are formed and powders are compressed. If and how can CFD simulate these solids and demonstrate these effects? So how to incorporate physical and chemical properties into the model and how to calibrate them also.
Are we talking about solids specifically here, Celia?
Yeah, yeah.
Solids. Okay.
How they are blended, but also how they are formed and compressed.
Formed also. Yeah, maybe this is a very good question for our CTO, Usman.
Yeah.
Usman, can you join?
Yes. Well, there are different ways to model granules. If you have granules, and it really depends on how much loading they are. So if there are too many, I mean, if they are the primary phase in your system, we can actually model them in a more continuous way. And then there is normally a theory very much similar to kinetic gas theory. It's called granular kinetic theory. And you can actually take into account compressibility of the granules. And then if you have the granules are not the most dominant phase in your system, you can actually model them more discretely. And then you can actually track and see how they are interacting with each other. Whereas then I see you mentioned about compression of the powders. This can certainly be modeled CFD in either of the approaches. So it depends how much granules you have. If you have dispersed, it will be a little bit different approach, with more discrete, and if there are larger numbers, it will be more continuous. But in both cases, you can take into account bulk viscosities, bulk densities, granule properties, their intensities, their molecular weights, for example. Even the shapes. So if they are like very large granules, even the shapes can be taken into account. Different size ranges can be taken into account. So yeah, it certainly can be answered with the help of CFD. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Okay, again, adding to that, the first thing we always do is we will start with the objective. So this is always question number one. What do you really want to get out of this that you don't have right now? So again, in this specific case, we will ask this question. If we are able to answer that question, we can actually propose the right methodology. Yeah. Okay, so good. So we have time for some conclusions now, and then of course we can answer some additional questions. So it's now actually a very good time to write down your remaining questions so we can take them after the conclusions. It's just one slide, huh? So we are almost there. But what are the take-home messages of this webinar? We have seen a very broad array. Huh? I know people that were expecting very much into detail things. For example, which solvers do you use? Which CFD approaches do you use? How do you model things? They will be still a bit hungry, but I would recommend you to send us your questions later. But yeah, again, coming back to the objective, we want to give you a very broad and wide overview of what's possible today, right? So the first message we want to give is, well, how a process really works often deviates a lot from how it is perceived to work. And this is generally something we see when people apply CFD for the first time. If you have not done any CFD simulation for your system, well, you will assume a certain behavior. And we have seen so many surprises when you do CFD that you actually learn a lot of new things. And typically it's very counterintuitive how things work. I hope it was also clear to you that very subtle differences in operation or design can have a drastic impact on process performance or the risk you take in having a deteriorating process performance. And if it's not known why, if it's quite invisible, you cannot really cope with it and change it for the future. And this is really a very important thing here. So, the third point here is that CFD is a very powerful and mature engineering tool. I mean, we have very good software, very good models, very good computers available, and they can really simulate a wide array of applications. And I wanted to really illustrate this with the examples today. So, I mean, we are not talking about months typically. Also, we have a lot of projects that finish in a matter of weeks. So it means from start meeting to end reporting, sorry. So including intermediate meetings with the customer, few weeks, you have done like many scenarios. So it's very important that you take this time aspect into consideration. And what we think is a very disruptive, and I mean, extremely high value application of CFD in pharma is using CFD for scale up and scale down. Because if you make the business cases there, we are talking about huge numbers in terms of time and also in terms of cost. Costs related to a loss of APIs, testing equipment, man hours, analysis, and things like that. So this is where we will be focusing on a lot in the coming months and also years. So in the end, it comes down to 4 major benefits. You want to save costs. That's a very important thing. It can be analysis costs, even opportunity costs. So if you can come with a certain product to the market a bit faster, that's also a lot of cost. Then we have time savings. Of course, then we have the optimal performance. And performance is both the specs, but also the controllability and reliability. Knowing that it will perform like you want it to perform. And then the 4th one is also very important. If you're a scientist or you're working with processes, you want to have the learning, you want to understand your process, which gives you a confidence boost and also allows you to take much better decisions in the future. So these 4 are really very important. Okay, so for people that want to leave here, please don't forget to fill in the questionnaire. We are very interested in your feedback. It will appear after you have closed this. And for people that still want to continue a bit, we will still devote some time for the Q&A. So I will go back to my colleague, Celia.
Yeah, sorry, I was still muted. There's a question on how we can optimize a process or parameter based on CFD. For example, the geometry of wastewater treatment reactors or other processes. So yeah, I think this is quite a good question, a bit to explain.
Okay, yeah. Well, step number 1 we do is checking, is it an existing process or is it something that still has to be built? Very important. If it's an existing one, you have something that is there and you have limited degrees of freedom, right? Everything has a cost and an effort associated with. Step number 1 we do in that case is we start analyzing, so simulating the current system, and we look at the results. Typically, these results show the weak spots. It can be, I come back to the output, bad mixing, shear, whatever it is, weak spots. And then we as AM team can take a leading role there, but sometimes the customer wants to do that. We generate practical solutions. For example, can we do something with that mixer, or can we change that inlet structure? We do another simulation and we look at the improvements and we do the comparison. And this is kind of an iterative way of working that goes very well because you build further on the previous simulations. Very similar if you look at new systems. The only difference is that you start from scratch. So this is, of course, where you can use a lot of expert knowledge and experience, because the first design you make can already be based on what you have learned from the past. So typically we can start with a rather good base design and then we further optimize it. So of course, the space you have to move if you talk about new systems, it's much bigger. Huh? Yeah, but still we have seen, for example, in pharma, a lot of equipment has been strongly regulated. For example, you cannot change the vessel size so easily. But what we have seen is that people can change, for example, the length of the pipe. They can change maybe an impeller type, or maybe the rotation speed, or maybe the feeding regime or pumping regime. Still, a lot can be played with within the regulatory boundaries, let's say. Very, very important things. I hope this answers the question. Yeah. Other questions, Celia?
No, that was the last one as far as I can see. So I think we can conclude on time almost.
Yeah, it's incredible. I never expected this. It's 4 p.m. We have to close. But yeah, again, if you have remaining questions, go to amteamprocess.com. You can see a lot of cases there and our email address, or just reply one of the emails you got. We will gladly answer them. Don't forget to fill in the questionnaire that will appear after closing this window. So wait a bit and then fill in the questionnaire. Well, I hope it was very interesting for you. And is there one remaining? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. An important question. Can you share the presentation? Can you share the presentation? What we will do is we will definitely distribute the slides and also put a recording online on our YouTube channel. So I think this will be great information for everybody. So you can actually look at it with your colleagues or pick some interesting parts for you. So definitely we will follow up on this. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's one, maybe to come back to the last question. So based on what you told us, the CFD needs a process of trial and error. I think there it's not just trial and error. It's really a calculation of what can be done in reality and then tested virtually.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what is a big difference? I wouldn't call it trial and error.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I mention this now, so you can
exactly. The big difference is if you are doing trial and error, the next decision you take is not based on earlier information. So it's random trial and error. If you are doing CFD, you run a simulation, and the next one you will run with a modified design or operation is based on what you got from the last one. So I mean, it's a very structural process of killing problems and troubleshooting. So, well, of course, you can still interpret it as that, because you have to change something and you still have to see if it will work. But I would say it's based on a lot of information, right? Yeah.
And there's one additional question now, how to address micro and meso mixing in vessels.
Okay, micro meso mixing. Maybe that's Usman, you can add to what I'm going to say, okay? I will talk high level, you can complement me a bit. But of course, you can use different modeling approaches, going very detailed and going very broad. Again, it depends on the question if you have to, how detailed you have to go, for example, in turbulence modeling. But yeah, all I can say is we have been simulating systems, for example, inside a tubular membrane that is like less than 1 millimeter in diameter or a few millimeters. So you can really work at that scale as well. Yeah. But then I'll go to Usman. Maybe you can add something to that.
No, but that's a good answer, Wim.
Okay.
And actually, we can even go to a level where we can model capillary motion. So not really convective, but capillary. So that is the level of resolution you can go into. And the good thing about CFD is the scale is very. It's not really a limit to your CFD models. And there's a variety of CFD models available for every kind of scale. So of course, for capillary, you will not use turbulence models, but a bit different ones. But it can handle, certainly. It's all Navier-Stokes equation. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, indeed. And the specific low level, or like high detailed modeling, for example, of capillary forces, this is called microfluidics. So it's like a branch of fluid dynamics. Yeah. But you can go very detailed. Yeah, we have seen it. I should have put an example here of this membrane because that's really nice to see. We have actually looked at it, at the shear calculations inside the membrane, and in a very different independent research, they had been investigating the same membrane, and the shear profiles were really matching quite well. Yeah, but that's really like very detailed level. Yeah. Okay, other questions, Celia? There's still some space for questions. We are still here, so we haven't closed it.
Well, there's a no. Okay, it's answered. No, I think there are no more questions left.
Okay,
So
then we can close. Well, okay, great. So we will share some information after the webinar. Again, fill in the questionnaire. So don't close too soon. You will see this pop-up of Google form. And then, yeah, on behalf of our whole team, because this was a great team effort, I also want to thank our team actually for the splendid simulation work. We have been working with a lot of different people together for such simulations. Generally, we do it. And also thank you, of course, for joining and for attending until the end, because if you look at the audience right now, this is the real diehard audience. Yeah. So congratulations to be a diehard. Okay, hope to see you next time, and we can close here.